Hello and welcome back to Thinking Deliberately. This is episode 20. We're going to talk about culture, change, and the cognitive intentions that shape them. In the last episode, we looked at why so much coaching is stagnant. It helps people resolve problems inside the construction they already have, but it doesn't necessarily develop the capacity doing the constructing. So today we move from the individual to the organization, because even excellent coaching encounters a rather inconvenient fact. A leader may expand their awareness in the coaching room and then return to an environment that rewards the old construction. The culture contracts the choice that coaching helped make visible. So today we are talking about culture, change, and the cognitive intentions that shape what an organization repeatedly notices, permits, and rewards. And we should begin with a confession. Organizations talk about culture with extraordinary confidence for something they often define as a feeling. We hear about high performance cultures, innovative cultures, people first cultures, even agile cultures, whatever that means, and sometimes values led cultures. And then you ask what culture actually is. And after a brief tour of the company values, somebody says, it's how we do things around here. And that's not completely wrong, but it is simply too vague to be useful. It describes the result without explaining how the result keeps being produced. So, from a constructive development theory perspective, culture is construction repeated until it becomes normal. It's the recurring pattern through which an organization makes some things important, some things safe, some things risky, and some things almost impossible to say. Culture appears in what gets noticed, what gets ignored, whose interpretation carries weight, and which questions are welcomed, which ones are politely buried beneath the agenda. What happens after somebody tells the truth? What happens when a stated value becomes inconvenient? So, culture is not merely what people believe, it is what people learn will happen next. And that is why the poster on the wall tells you very little. The consequences tell you almost everything. An organization says, we want people to speak up. Someone speaks up, the senior leader becomes defensive, the meeting goes cold, and the person is described afterwards as difficult. Nothing in the values has changed, but the culture has just taught a lesson. An organization says, we want innovation. Someone proposes an unfamiliar option. The approval process asks for certainty, precedent, 3 years of evidence, and a guarantee that nobody will be embarrassed. The idea returns 6 months later wearing a smaller hat. Again, the culture has taught a lesson. Maybe an organization says, people come first. And then the numbers become uncomfortable, and every decision reveals that people came first only while first place was inexpensive. Culture listens to consequences, not slogans. Now, this is where we need to be precise. An organization is not a giant person. It does not literally possess a mind, a single intention, or a cognitive intention in the way an individual does. People possess cognitive intentions, but systems, routines, and power can repeatedly privilege the same orientations. Over time, those orientations become easier to enact, safer to express, and more likely to influence decision. Other orientations become expensive. They attract delay, doubt, ridicule, exclusion, or even punishment. And the result can look as though the organization itself has a preferred way of thinking. What we are observing is an emergent pattern. A culture is not a collective personality. It is a recurring pattern of permission and consequence. And that distinction is important because cognitive intentions are not labels to attach to an organization. They are lenses for examining what keeps being privileged in particular contexts. So take procedures and options. A procedure's orientation attends to sequence, method, reliability, and proven steps. And that can be essential. You probably want some procedures in aviation, surgery, and the person responsible for payroll. But when an organization repeatedly privileges procedures under every condition, deviation begins to look like danger. People learn that following the process is safer than improving the outcome, and the procedure stops serving the work and the work begins serving the procedure. So, at the other pole, an options orientation attends to alternatives, possibilities, and new routes. I have a big options pattern. And that can create innovation and adaptability. But if options is repeatedly rewarded while completion is neglected, the organization becomes brilliant at beginning new initiatives, new pilots, new platforms, new things, Basically, you're going to start something new before finishing the old thing. The problem is not the preference, the problem is captivity. The same is true of even things like towards and away from. A towards orientation attends to goals, gains, and desired outcomes. It can create energy and direction. But if it becomes the only permissible orientation, warning signs are reconstructed as negativity. Caution becomes a lack of ambition. Bad news is softened on its journey upwards until the board receives a reassuring fiction. An away from orientation attends to risk, error, and what must be prevented. And that can protect quality, safety, and reputation. But if it dominates every conversation, avoiding blame can become more important than creating value. The safest decision wins, even when the safest decision is slow decline. And then there's internal and external reference. Internal reference evaluates through one's own standards and judgments. In a culture that repeatedly privileges it, people may show conviction and independent thought. They may also stop listening. External reference, or it's an external locus of evaluation. It attends to evidence, feedback, expectations, and the judgment of others. It can create responsiveness and learning, and it can also produce fashionable strategy. The organisation changes direction every time a competitor publishes a slide deck. Again, CDT is not asking us to choose the correct side and print it on a lanyard. It's asking whether the people involved can recognise the orientation being privileged, notice what it makes available, and recover the alternatives it excludes. That is the developmental issue. A repeated cognitive intention can become cultural when it is reinforced across many events. A senior leader rewards certainty, a meeting therefore favours people who sound certain. Recruitment selects for the same performance. Promotion confirms it. Now I'm thinking of things like the police. Reporting removes ambiguity before information travels upwards. Eventually, uncertainty is no longer merely uncomfortable. It becomes culturally unintelligible. People don't say, we are suppressing uncertainty today. They say, we need people who are solutions focused. And that's how culture disappears from view. It becomes common sense, and common sense is often a construction that has forgotten it was constructed. And this helps explain why so much culture change fails. The visible language changes while the learning environment remains the same. New values, same consequences. New behaviours, same power. New strategy, same permission structure. The old culture does not need to defeat the initiative. It simply reconstructs the initiative in its own image. Empowerment becomes permission to take decisions the leader already approves of. Accountability becomes a more attractive word for blame. Collaboration becomes another meeting. Agility becomes doing the same amount of governance at greater speed. And then the organisation adopts the vocabulary and preserves the construction. And that is why employees can appear cynical during transformation. Cynicism is not always wisdom, of course. Sometimes a new idea is dismissed because habit is comfortable. But cynicism can also be organisational memory. People remember the previous launch. They remember what leaders said. They remember what leaders protected when pressure arrived, and they're comparing the announcement with the pattern. What leaders call resistance may be many different things. Should we list them? Fear, fatigue, disagreement, overload, self-protection, and it might be the accurate detection of a contradiction. Treating all resistance as one thing destroys information. It also protects the change program from having to learn. If people resist, the problem is located in the people. The construction behind the change remains conveniently innocent. So what would CDT-informed culture change actually do? Well, first, it would stop beginning with the desired adjectives: open, bold, inclusive, accountable, all that kind of nonsense, all capable of becoming expensive wallpaper. Instead, begin with events. Choose moments in which culture becomes consequential. A difficult target is missed, or a junior employee challenges a senior assumption, a customer complaint conflicts with the internal story. A leader behaves badly while producing excellent numbers. And then examine what was constructed in that moment. What was the stated intention? What outcome appeared to be protected in practice? What information became available? What information disappeared, but which choices were genuinely permissible? What did everyone learn from what happened next? And this is intention, awareness, choice, response applied to the pattern of an organizational event, not because the organization has one mind, because IACR can help us trace how the people, systems, and power in that event constructed the outcome together. So, next, examine repetition. One defensive meeting does not define a culture, but if challenge repeatedly produces defensiveness, delay, or reputational cost, a permission structure is forming. If bad news repeatedly becomes safer when softened, the system is training distortion. If people repeatedly succeed by rescuing work at the last minute, the organization may say values planning while rewarding heroics. Culture is the pattern, not the anecdote. Third, identify the cognitive intentions being privileged by the pattern. Not this is a procedures organization, and that because that turns into a lens, basically that turns the lens into a diagnosis. Ask instead, in this kind of decision, which orientation becomes dominant? What does it help us to notice? What does it make harder to see? And which complementary orientation is present but powerless? Which one is absent completely? And the aim is not to remove the existing pattern, it may contain important intelligence. The aim is to make the pattern available to choice. Fourth, change what happens next. If a leader asks for challenge, their response to challenge is part of the intervention. If a company wants learning, its treatment of an intelligent failure is part of the intervention. If collaboration matters, the reward system is part of the intervention. If long-term thinking matters, the questions asked under quarterly pressure are part of the intervention. Change is not installed by communication, it is learned through consequence. And obviously, communication is key. But when communication and consequence disagree, consequence wins every time. Fifth, work at a scale people can actually enact. A culture is not reconstructed by asking thousands of people to wake up on Monday with a new set of values. It changes through repeated events in which a different construction becomes visible, permissible, and consequential. One meeting changes, one decision process changes, one promotion criterion changes. Then the new response must survive pressure, because pressure is where the culture checks whether leadership meant it. This also means power cannot be edited out of culture change. Culture is co-constructed, but not by equal participants. Everyone participates, not everyone determines the consequences. Episode 19 gave us the principle, power scales construction. The construction of a senior leader can become a meeting rule, a funding decision, a promotion standard, or an organizational silence. So leaders cannot announce that culture belongs to everyone and then step away from their disproportionate role in producing it. Nor does that mean leaders can manufacture culture by instruction. People construct their own responses. They notice contradiction and they adapt. They comply, resist, reinterpret, protect themselves, sometimes protect others, and maybe quietly create better practices in the gaps. Culture emerges from that interaction between local construction and structural consequence. And that's why it's more complex than tone from the top. The top matters enormously, but culture also travels sideways, downwards and back upwards, carrying memory with it. The practical question is not simply what culture do we want? It is, what are people repeatedly being taught is real here? What are they taught about truth, about risk, about authority? Failure, sometimes customers, about what happens when the value and the target collide. And then comes the harder question. Which of our systems and responses keep teaching it? That is where culture becomes workable. Not easy, but workable. It's no longer a mysterious atmosphere hovering above the building. It's a pattern that can be observed in specific events, traced through consequences, and made available to deliberate reconstruction. But there is a final difficulty. The people with the greatest authority to change the pattern may also be the people whose construction the pattern protects. A board cannot easily observe the frame through which it is observing. An executive team may ask for honesty while remaining unaware of the conditions its own responses create. So, who helps senior authority to see the culture within which it is participating without simply supplying another set of answers? That is where we go next. In the next episode, we will explore the deliberate thinking consultant, not an outsourced expert who tells the board what to think, but someone who helps the board observe how it is constructing what can be thought. So for now, here is the uncomfortable thought. Your culture is not what the organization says it values. It is what people learn will happen when those values become inconvenient. Culture changes when a different construction becomes possible, and the consequences prove that it's real. And that is thinking deliberately. Thank you.